Alright, so now that I've gotten my glass of water, considering that I'm a bit sick right now, I can discuss a certain subject that I want to discuss right now, and that's been pretty popular in regards to evaluating Eddy Reynoso's quality as a trainer, because his fighters as of late have not been particularly successful. Now, Eddy Reynoso, at one point, well, I should say maybe 3 months ago, was considered the head and shoulders best trainer in the world, and that was largely concocted based on the success of Oscar Valdez and his upset victory over Miguel Berchelt, and also people like say Julio Cesar Martinez entering his camp and having a bit of success, although he wasn't really directly involved for the most part. And I don't even really believe Reynoso was in his corner, I think, until maybe the Joel Cordova fight or maybe the Roman Gonzalez fight. Maybe McWilliams Arroyo. I don't know for a fact. I think he was in the corner for the Arroyo fight, but I can't be too sure. And then you also have Andy Ruiz recently entered his camp, exited and then re-entered. Luis Neri also entered, and then eventually exited his camp. And Eddy Reynoso, who had actually built up somewhat of a cult of personality, rendered a lot of these guys, like a Luis Neri and an Andy Ruiz, rendered them demonized, in large part by the boxing cognoscenti, if you will, for leaving his camp and seek out what they perceive to be greener pastures. And now that his fighters, in the case of Canelo Alvarez, Oscar Valdez, and I guess maybe you could say Joselito Velasquez, some people weren't too impressed with his performance actually as of recent. And also you have, who else? Yeah, Julio Cesar Martinez, I'm forgetting. In their recent losses, now people are starting to pick up on things that I had been stating, I think, well over 2 years ago about Eddy Reynoso, and where I think his deficiencies as a trainer come from. Now, I talked about Canelo's loss to Bivol already in the video, but I want to expound upon it a bit further, and where Canelo's weaknesses have always come from. Now, if you want to evaluate him as a fighter, just from the waist up and his fundamentals, so that would include his punch technique, that would include his punch selection, counter-punching, ability to lead, his jab, his upper body movement. He's one of the better fighters on the planet. I don't think he's necessarily better than a Roman Gonzalez, but really besides him, you can make an argument that from the waist up, he is possibly the best fighter as of right now, because he has a great combination of upper body movement and punch technique, at least when he's in range. However, a lot of that dissipates because of the fact that he has bad footwork. And I don't care what anybody says, Canelo does not have good footwork. And that's just the bottom line, on top of having slow feet. Now, a lot of people who like to try to glorify Canelo a lot of the times and like to make him out to be a little bit better than what he is, a lot of film study channels on YouTube like to talk about how his footwork is actually extremely subtle, and how it's actually, and how, looking towards the things Canelo is doing and trying to dissect it more than it needs to be dissected, as opposed to oftentimes evaluating the deficiencies of his opponent, have a lot of people to become blind to that deficiency and what ultimately is a deficiency. Because if you look at Canelo and his fights, the guys he struggled with the most are Floyd, right? Austin Trout, Arislan Lara, Dmitry Bivol, Gennady Golovkin. And if you want to look at his toughest fight, I guess at 168, I suppose you could say Caleb Plant. Now, if you want to look at his easiest fights, we'll say guys like Chavez Jr. or a Callum Smith. and say, I don't know, maybe a guy like, even a Danny Jacobs to an extent, even though that wasn't really an easy fight for him because he did fade down the stretch of the fight. Now, what did those guys ultimately have in common? Well, what they had in common is they didn't make Canelo work with his feet. They were both relatively inactive, or they're all relatively inactive. They're all relatively stiff, and they were not making Canelo work, or making him close the distance, or making him back out of distance to get into his ideal range. His construct was basically cut out already for him. Now, Canelo, as I mentioned, is one of the better fighters from the waist up, but from the waist down, he's not an elite fighter. Whenever someone forces him to cut the ring off, and whenever someone forces him to be inactive with his feet, or turns him specifically, forcing him to use his knees to pivot and redirect his attention to a different direction, he can really only beat you one way, and that is, or he can really only beat you a couple of ways, and that is if you're not active enough to make him pay for his inactivity and his ability to get within his construct to be able to land what are his bombs, or if he knocks you out, and that is, of course, if the fight is on the up and up. Erislandy Lara, and you can make an argument that that fight wasn't really on the up and up either, cost himself the fight ultimately because from the fourth round onwards he was simply not active enough to seal enough rounds to be able to convince the judges. And when you're fighting Canelo, you have to significantly outland him, and in most cases that requires you to have the advantage in work rate. Floyd did not allow himself to be outworked, and for the most part was just jabbing, turning, and he called it easy work. And why was that? Because Canelo was pretty much wailing on him, just throwing haymakers out of construct. And he was unable to get in position to really land any significant blows. In the case of Caleb Plant, ultimately Plant waned down the stretch of the fight and got caught. But Plant was doing at least something similar. At least it was a bit more rough around the edges, though, because of how often he would languish on the ropes. But jabbing, turning, allowing himself to outwork Canelo in a lot of the early rounds. And Canelo had no answers for that. He beat him on fitness, brute strength, and power, for the most part. He did not beat him because he managed to expertly cut down the ring on him, necessarily. He never really had an answer for that. And even when Caleb Plant would show bursts, at least in the late rounds, on occasion of being able to jab and move and use his pivoting to be able to get out of the way, Canelo didn't really have any answers, but too often he would languish on the ropes and give him opportunities to land. And if you try to stand in the pocket with Canelo to trade blow for blow with him, he's going to pick you apart a lot of the time. In Golovkin's case, he used his brute strength to be able to push Canelo back, force him to be active on his back foot, and he couldn't punch on the move without falling off balance. And he was able to win the first fight, but it wasn't really on the up and up, so of course it ended as a draw. So, Canelo, who is basically the textbook Eddy Reynoso fighter, has basically the textbook Eddy Reynoso philosophy ingrained within his style, which is as a patient and relatively aggressive counterpuncher, has his biggest weaknesses when opponents force him to work and force him to determine the distance with his feet. Now, like I said with his footwork, he can inch forward and, against the southpaw, he has a bit of a rudimentary understanding of maybe how to gain lead foot position or maybe cut angles to a certain extent when guys are stationary and want to maybe get out of the way or reset. But in terms of when guys actually are active on their feet and force him to readjust and force him to set the distance with his own feet, he really doesn't know how to do that or has an understanding of how to do it. Now, let's evaluate some of Eddy Reynoso's other fighters. In the case of Oscar Valdez. Now, Oscar Valdez joined the Eddy Reynoso camp in 2019 in what was supposed to be his debut at 130 pounds against Andres Gutierrez, who eventually weighed in at 140 pounds and got the fight canceled. And now he's fighting at welterweight, too, in a few days, I think. So, Adam Lopez replaces him. He gets dropped. Adam Lopez, similarly, in that fight, was, I guess you could say similarly to like a Caleb Plant or a Floyd to Canelo, was moving around and forcing Oscar Valdez to be active on his feet. And Valdez was already from the early rounds pretty impatient. Consequently, Valdez was walking straight into punches and got dropped early on. Walked straight into a shot and got dropped. And he eventually was able to use his brute strength to get a premature stoppage, but we already see an example there. Now, Valdez decided in his next fight to incorporate a back foot game. Now, when you're looking at a great back foot boxer, like say an Alexander Usyk, there's a lot of variance. He's moving from side to side, he's not pulling back in straight lines, and he's able to combine upper body movement and the ability to change levels with his lateral movement. And when you look at a Canelo, whose head movement tends to stagnate when he moves, and similarly, Oscar Valdez in his fight against Jason Velez, which I want to talk about, is it depreciated significantly. And Velez was able to walk him back, land his jabs pretty much at will, and once again in this fight, his head movement stagnated. And he wasn't showing much change in direction in the fight. He was mostly just walking straight back in straight lines, allowing for Velez to basically land whatever he wanted on him. And I felt the fight was much closer than the scorecards read out at the time of the stoppage. Now, of course, Valdez, being the bigger man, physically, I don't believe he's bigger than Velez in dimensions, but having more of the brute strength, being the bigger puncher, the more accurate puncher also, a little bit fundamentally better than Velez, was able to win a good portion of the rounds, but he was still having a lot of problems, and a guy who's significantly below his level, supposed to be fighting as a gatekeeper against, guys like Jojo Diaz on the come-up, and eventually like Gabriel Flores in his next fight, I think. He's not supposed to be competing on that level to that degree, and giving an Oscar Valdez such a tough fight considering the gap in levels. The Miguel Berchelt fight, for those who attentively watched it, Valdez's flaw showed up again. Berchelt, in the fight, showed the inability to, as he usually does, shows the inability to be able to reduce his center of gravity to get underneath guys' guards and change levels. In this fight, his problems were further accentuated by the fact that he was severely weight drained, it appeared. Hadn't made the weight, I believe, in a year and a half since his fight against Jason Sosa in November 2019. And in between then, only had one fight at 135 against Eleazar Valenzuela, a gatekeeper. A durable gatekeeper, but still a gatekeeper nonetheless in a fight where he didn't look particularly good. And also in the fight subsequent to the Oscar Valdez fight, he proceeded to fight Namibian police officer Jeremiah Nakathila and get battered around the ring. So you be the judge on his condition heading into that fight against Oscar Valdez. But if you actually look in the middle portion of that fight, where Berchelt had the greatest portion of his success, it was when he was pushing Valdez back, and when he was actually moving backwards. He wasn't really doing anything fundamentally great on the back foot. He was just walking Berchelt pretty much directly into counters because he was so stationary, for the most part. And he was pulling back in straight lines, and Berchelt was actually able to land his jab pretty much at will for him in the 4th and 5th rounds. Because once again, once you get a Reynoso fighter moving, their head stops moving, or at least when you get their feet moving, their head stops moving, and then when you throw your straight punches, you fire your straight shots, as long as you have adequate enough accuracy and you have the frame to be able to get past their guard, then you're going to have a lot of success against them. And the bulk of Berchelt's success was doing exactly that. Even despite the fact that he was weakened and hurt, he was still getting to him. And then the next fight against Robson Conceição, who was moving on the back foot, and who was the best lateral mover I believe Valdez had faced to that point in his career, completely exposed him. And, well, I guess you could say the judges didn't save... the judges came in handy for Valdez in that fight. And robberies do suck, because in that fight against Conceição, who has a very similar style of fighting and methodology to Shakur Stevenson, won maybe 4, maybe 5 rounds if you're a family member. It's probably more like 3. You know, he couldn't even beat Conceição. He got outclassed by him. And a much more interesting fight in a Conceição versus Stevenson turned into a predictable mismatch in Shakur versus Valdez, which everybody who really had a functioning brain that wasn't biased or blinded by hatred or fanboyism understood what was going to happen. And he got outclassed against Stevenson, but the judges weren't there to save him. Julio Cesar Martinez, I mean, we know how he fights. The guys he has the most success against are guys like Christopher Rosales, who are for the most part rather stationary. You know, very physically strong for the weight. And if you don't have the footwork to get away from him, he can certainly light you up with combinations. He's a great body puncher. Martinez had a lot of success because he was pretty stationary and managed to stop him late in the fight. Prematurely, though. And then he fought against Jay Harris, managed to score a knockdown, but Jay Harris, who was using movement, caused him to struggle. Joel Cordova, who held his shape and didn't allow Martinez's footwork to be able to keep him pushing back. Martinez struggled against him, despite Cordova being nowhere really near world level. And then he fought against Chocolatito, who is a great fighter, an actually great fighter, not just a decent champion, a great fighter, and got absolutely battered around the ring. And so, I think we can deduce where Eddy Reynoso falls short as a trainer. Now, ultimately, a fighter-trainer relationship is about chemistry, and what mixes best with what. But Eddy Reynoso doesn't seem to understand, though, that you cannot just have a one-size-fits-all mentality. And he doesn't have any chemistry with any fighters who really deviate from what Canelo likes to do. And that's why these guys leave him. Luis Nery, who's typically, yes, a counterpuncher, but typically very aggressive, does throw a lot of punches, does work the body, does use angles. Under Reynoso was regulated to a more stationary target when he fought against Aaron Alameda. And Alameda subsequently was able to outbox him in the second half of the fight. Really, if they rematched, I feel like he probably would have won. And now that he's left Reynoso, he got stopped by Figueroa, predictably so. I mean, his ill discipline couldn't save him there, but he's come back and had a decent performance against Carlos Castro. Eddy Reynoso is a great trainer in terms of teaching guys the fundamentals of punching, counterpunching, and being able to anticipate and read guys' upper body and land accurate shots. He knows how to train pot shotting. But in terms of learning how to train footwork and how to close the gap or increase the gap between you and your opponent and being able to utilize that to dictate where exchanges are had, he simply really doesn't have any type of grasp on that. And even the fighter whom he trains with and spends the most time with has not seemed to understand or improve upon what has been his biggest weakness, being his footwork his entire career. But what the hell do I know? I'm just a guy who really doesn't do anything besides just watch these fights on a weekly basis. It's doesn't really matter what I think, but I mean, your fighters keep losing, man. They keep getting their ass whooped, and they keep getting their ass whooped in the same way that I described it. So Reynoso better figure something out and teach his fighters how to, move their feet and at least be mobile. So, yeah, have a good one.